Um, we were not 100% sure, kind of Jason and I, what we were going to speak about today. But one of the things we wanted to kind of talk about as a sort of kind of catching up on sort of what we're doing in terms of kind of artificial intelligence, and kind of how we're sort of approaching it in our work, was to talk a little bit about kind of our thought process as we generated our the English department's statement on generative AI and writing, which was the first kind of draft that was circulated to faculty of kind of verbiage that faculty could put on their syllabus to sort of govern or kind of account for the use of generative artificial intelligence technologies in their classrooms, right? And kind of the thing we wanted to think about um, in our presentation a little bit is kind of what's going on in English, which I know several speakers have been from our department. So what else is going on in English? And then also kind of talking a little bit about, because this is a presentation that's focused largely on sort of teaching policy, right? And the way that policy can intervene in sort of classroom practice or help shape kind of conversations around classroom practice. So we also wanted to kind of think a little bit about sort of the kind of different granularities of the way in which our response to generative AI can occur across the university, the way that kind of can be personal, can be institutional, but can also be at these kind of other levels. So that's sort of what we want to talk a little bit about during our 15 minutes. I think to get us started from my intro, I think Jason was going to talk a little bit about kind of why the English department to get us started.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So it's probably no surprise that as an English department, our primary kind of assessment criteria or assessment activity is writing. But I think there's a kind of and this also came out in a lot of the sort of alarmist rhetoric around sort of like first wave generative AI stuff, the kind of like moral panic of like, this is going to kill the college essay, this is going to ruin English departments, right? And so I think the thing I want to point out before Andrew talks more about the syllabus statement is I think there's this sort of misconception around English departments that they are only teaching writing in terms of literature or teaching writing about literature or using literature as their sort of primary mechanism for teaching writing. So I think one thing I want to point out is that we have a lot of people in our department, myself included, that have a background in writing studies or a background in rhetoric. And we're very interested in a sort of formalized theory of writing, teaching writing, and thinking about writing. And so we're kind of in this very interesting moment where people are starting to ask really foundational and critical and interesting questions about writing again. And these are questions that I've been, interested in my whole career. So it's on the one hand, it's kind of a strange and frustrating moment. I think I'm still very critical of this technology, as I think most of us probably are. But on the other hand, it's very exciting to see people suddenly care about writing again and in these new and interesting ways. So this is kind of the background, I guess, necessary to think about what we were trying to do as we were making the syllabus statement is how do we draw on that knowledge and how do we create something that's going to be adaptable for a wide range of people that teach writing towards a lot of different ends. So Andrew will talk a little bit about the statement itself.
Okay, got it. I unmuted myself. That continues to be the struggle. Here we are, 3 years into using Zoom, and anyway, it's fine. So yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of why a syllabus statement. So there's a QR code here. If I wasn't sure kind of what the sort of best modalities for this were. So if you want to take a picture of your phone, of your computer with your phone, you could do that. I've also got it in the chat. If you'd like to take a look at that. But this is the syllabus statement that we ended up producing and circulating to our department. And one of the things that we were initially sort of responding to in this document, as I think Jason mentioned, and one of the things I want to talk a little bit more about kind of throughout the rest of my portion of the presentation, is the way in which a lot of kind of the first responses to Gen AI and sort of the moment in which we sort of began working on this project were sort of, again, kind of thinking about this in terms of the moral panic, right? or thinking about them in terms of like um, prohibition of use, and then also kind of like plagiarism detection, right? Like how can we, so many of the conversations were how can we detect when students are using artificial intelligence? And I think we didn't want that to be the way the conversation developed. So we were trying to think about how can we sort of intervene in that. And one of the things we also wanted to think about was how can we communicate to our faculty, and what's the most efficient way to communicate to our faculty that these tools also can play a role in the writing process, especially for a lot of faculty who is used. You might, if you were to imagine a sort of stereotypical English professors using a computer, you wouldn't be far off from at least a portion of our of the technical aptitudes of some of our faculty. So we wanted to be kind of reaching that sort of demographic too, to be like, no, there are ways in which this is okay. The things that you're reading online or in the news may not be necessarily the state of things. So we wanted to think about how could we start a conversation in this direction and kind of use that through course policy, right? Because that was the thing we wanted to think about, was like the way in which we articulate our values as an institution, and the way we articulate our values as a department, and the way we articulate our values as individuals instructors through the kind of things that we put on a syllabus. So we were sort of thinking about what's a document that we could give to our faculty in order to help them kind of better sort of see how this stuff works and how maybe we can start the conversation. Because one of the things I think that's also important about this in terms of thinking about generative AI in the writing process is that where this fits into even the traditional college essay, it's not entirely clear, right? Many people have been experimenting with different kinds of exercises to think about like what can AI do well in an English department. And like that's the kind of conversation that we want to continue. But in order for that to happen, we have to sort of demystify the thing, or the way we talk about this in science technology studies is to open the black box, right? And that was the other thing that was important for me, at least in terms of that document, was how can we articulate a little bit about what these things do to our faculty, so they have a better understanding of kind of how to interact with them, both in their own pedagogical experiments, but also in their as their students use them too. Because one of the things Jason and I were definitely thinking a lot about is kind of past moral panics in writing studies, of which there have been several. Because it seemed important to kind of contextualize this, because like on the one hand, the things that artificial intelligence can do seem like they immediately, and do, I don't want to say seems like, but can, present legitimate problems to the evaluation of writing and the way in which writing has been assessed. But one of the things that I think we struck on kind of early, and I see people having this conversation more and more, and I'm glad that kind of the conversation has shifted in this direction. But thinking about generative AI in relationship to Wikipedia, right? When Wikipedia first released, there was another sort of similar moral panic. I think there were a lot of blood was spilled in the Chronicles of Higher Education, for instance, about the way that like this was going to, make plagiarism worse, and like it was going to make students, um, you know, whatever. And I don't even remember what the arguments were, but the point was that this was seen as this, it's going to be disruptive to what we do, right? This was going to disrupt the research process. This was going to be a dangerous influence on our students. And now I think the way we approach Wikipedia, although I still feel like I'm authorizing my students to get away with something when I say, oh yeah, you can use Wikipedia to research a paper. They're like, really? But it strikes me that like Wikipedia is now seen as sort of a place to start one's research from, right? Like this is not the place that your research journey ends, but it's a good starting point, right? And so one of the things that we wanted to again think about in kind of crafting a syllabus statement, right, is rather than sort of you play into any kind of alarmist rhetoric, and also rather than play into the sense that things are going to be the same, right, we wanted to think about, is there a way to kind of move along this process of moving from a moral panic to thinking about this as a writing tool. Yeah, and so the ways that we can kind of all invent together sort of how generative artificial intelligence can better function in the writing process. I think at this point, Jason's going to talk a little bit about what else we're kind of doing from here and kind of next steps and things of that nature.
Yeah, so we want to be careful with our time here, but I just want to point to a couple of other resources that we'll add that I think might be helpful. And this is coming pretty explicitly out of writing studies, but designed for a wider higher education audience. So the first is I've been working very closely with my colleague, Sydney I. Dobrin, who just published last month the first book really on AI and writing. And I know there's been a lot of books on like using AI and chat prompt engineering and all of that kind of stuff, but this is really a book about what does it mean to write? What does it mean to teach writing in a post generative AI moment? And so I'll include a link to that. So he has two works. AI and writing just came out last month, and then earlier this summer he had a short free educational resource called "Talking About Generative AI: A Guide for Educators." Both of these, again, are coming from someone with a long career in writing studies, who's been asking questions about writing and technology for a really long time, but is writing a document designed for a more open audience, and to be more interdisciplinary and more applied in its approach. And then the second thing I want to point to is an edited collection that just came out called Text Gen Ed. This is an open access resource from the WAC Clearinghouse. And this is it's an edited collection, so it's got the editor's overview, which is excellent. And then if you go to the bottom of that page, there's a list of subtopics, I guess. And each one of those has 4 or 5 or 6 contributors, most of whom are from writing studies and rhetoric, talking about experiments or projects or writing assignments or writing activities that they've done in their classrooms, and then reflecting on those experiences. So this is a really good repository of actual post-AI writing assignments, writing activities, and sort of reflections on whether what worked, what didn't work. And it's going to be an ongoing repository. So they're now accepting sort of a rolling submission of what they're calling Text Gen Ed experiments. And just as an aside, I have a piece in there if you want to look that up. So I'm also promoting myself. I think that's all we have, and I guess we can open it up to Q&A.